I can think of 1,000 reasons why DEI shouldn't die. The Perspective View podcast by CC America LLC is a show dedicated to discussing diversity, culture, and context beyond the boardroom. DEI today is more than a buzzword on a billboard. It is creating safe spaces for varying perspectives, ideas, and experiences without fear of being canceled because you don't conform. Let's tear down the walls together and build a new foundation with an open mind and understanding that the world revolves around the context of perspective. My name is Tomeria Jordan, and I am the host of the Perspective View podcast, a show dedicated to discussing diversity, culture, and context beyond the boardroom. So the reason that we are here today, and this is the top of the new year, Happy New Year, it is 2024, and the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion is a hot one. So you may recall back in December, Elon Musk tweeted essentially about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what he said had individuals really thinking about, the efforts that companies have put into DEI today. And so he essentially stated that DEI must die. And essentially, he stated that the point was to end discrimination, not replace it with different discrimination. So for anyone that's new here, welcome. For anyone that is returning, thank you so much for your ongoing support. We are glad that you are here. So when we think about what Elon Musk said in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, replacing discrimination with a different form of discrimination, I thought that that was an interesting point. And while I wholeheartedly agree that we should not be replacing discrimination with more discrimination, I think that it's interesting that the choice words were DEI must die. So that is why at the beginning of this episode, I stated I can think of 1,000 plus reasons why DEI shouldn't die. And the reason that I say that is when you think about the history of America, we cannot ignore that we have a colorful and checkered past. And so when you think about in the United States specifically, between 1525 and 1866, over 12 million people were kidnapped from Africa and sent to the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade. And when we think about the number of people who died on the journey and those who arrived to the different colonies who were essentially imposed to servitude, and they were sometimes killed and treated improperly and treated in ways that were very inhumane. And so if we ignore the history of our country, then it makes it difficult to understand why we're even in this situation in the first place. Because when we think about slavery, that lasted for hundreds of years. And then segregation started from 1865 and ended in 1954. But that's where mass incarceration started to proliferate. And so this data is from Fitchburg State University, but there are several data sources with regard to why diversity matters and how we got here. So while I understand what Elon Musk said in terms of creating additional discrimination, I just find it interesting that discrimination didn't start with minorities. Discrimination was started by the majority, who then essentially subjected minorities to discrimination. And now they're saying that the solution to help minorities creates more discrimination. And so I oftentimes will say that we can certainly have a different perspective. We are not all going to agree. I totally understand that. That is normal, but we should be able to disagree respectfully. And so when we look at just diversity stats in the US and even abroad, we will find that diversity does matter. And there's different ways we can look at it. So when we look at it on the positive side, there are many benefits to DE and I. And so one main one being the economic benefits. When you think about the fact that diversity of teams helps enhance innovation, creativity, and also leading to better business outcomes, you can clearly see how having a diverse team matters. But what I find interesting is, from a perspective view, is that the same people who will say that diversity, equity, and inclusion doesn't matter and that things should be based on merit, then how is it that we can see that relationships have opened doors for some individuals in their particular roles, but we assume that individuals that are from a minority background, that they were given the job not based on merit, not based on skills, education, or experience? So a quote from Fox Business says, "I think if we restore true meritocracy in this country and embrace true diversity of thought, chances are we're actually going to have a bunch of different shades of element and a range of genders in different positions. But let it be not a goal. Let it just be a byproduct of actually selecting for people who are the best person for the job, and especially in a university setting, diverse viewpoints as well." So Elon Musk seems to believe that the individuals who do get a job and that happen to be of a different background potentially may not have the background and or experience or education, expertise, whatever it is, to be in those particular roles. And that naturally individuals are going to select people from different demographic backgrounds. But we've seen historically that that has not happened. And so when we think about that, I find it interesting that we will say, let's just handle it the merit way, when we have also witnessed throughout history that sometimes individuals look out for people who look like them and or people that they know. So how is that any different than looking at the fact that if in a particular company, all of the demographics appear to look the same, that we are not even giving other people an opportunity to come to the table with their ideas or suggestions or what have you. So take, for instance, personality assessments. And the reason I can speak to this is I did it for years, and I would administer the assessments and also provide the feedback. But when I think about how the assessments are developed, the research and development on the assessments, they typically will utilize a diverse pool of candidates to solicit that research, that data, that evidence. However, within companies can select who they would like to take the assessment to create the prototype of who would be best for certain types of positions. So take, for instance, succession planning. So if we have a certain demographic. So say, for instance, everyone at the executive level, they are all Caucasian males. So then we test all Caucasian males, and then we create a prototype and say everyone should fit into this prototype. Well, here's the thing. By natural selection, you will never probably get anyone outside of that demographic group, because there are different life experiences and things that shape who we are as individuals that we may not have the same point of view. So essentially, and even individuals within that same demographic will not always have the same point of view because they have different backgrounds, different experiences, different education, all of those different factors. However, the profile of the individual, they have some similarities, in which if you're looking for those similarities, you are not going to find it in a group that is different. And so whether that's by gender, race, religion, all of those things. And so when I hear people say and or insinuate that individuals received a job because of affirmative action, not based on their merit, that in and of itself is insulting, and also an example of why DEI shouldn't die. So I started with the economic benefits in terms of business, but I find it interesting that from a marketing standpoint, if, say, for instance, I was looking for someone to help me market ethnic hair care products, I would be more than happy to go out and find someone that fit a certain demographic and or mold because I wanted to make money on that particular product. So the way I see it is, isn't it the same thing as it relates to hiring and other decisions? Other reasons why DEI shouldn't die. We talked about the innovation and the economic benefits, but when you think about productivity can increase because you bring in people with different skill sets and different experiences. You really improve your competitiveness from a global standpoint because you have individuals maybe working for your company that can resonate with different audiences, and therefore they can attract different talent. They can attract a market that you may not have been otherwise able to reach. And so when you think about it from an internal business perspective, you look at reduced turnover costs. You look at resilience, social impact. There are just so many things that DEI can help with. And then within each of those segment and or areas, there are sub items that highlight the importance of DEI. So say, for instance, we talked about like customer satisfaction and the fact that if you hire individuals that fit a certain demographic, they are more likely to be able to reach that demographic from a sales perspective. But when you think about even from a legal and ethical compliance standpoint, it really helps organizations comply with anti-discrimination laws and ethical standards. But the reason that the discrimination laws had to be put in place is because discrimination existed. So if there was no discrimination, we would not need discrimination laws. And so I feel like it's a circular conversation because literally we will create an issue, meaning people in general will create an issue and then try to create the solution for the said issue, but then dictate how other people receive and or perceive said issue. And so when we look at data, for instance, this article written by Built In includes census data. So based on 2020 census data, the average US unemployment rate sits at approximately 8.1%, and that was in 2020. But the US unemployment rates were higher for people who were Black, 11.5%, and Hispanic or Latino, 10.6%. And when we look at that, there are disparities. When we look at people with disabilities, in 2022, 7.6% of people with disabilities in the United States were unemployed. And so when we look at those different types of things, we look at those factors, it goes beyond just race. And I think some people equate the DEI movement with race because of the murder of George Floyd and the, I will say, the number of companies that jumped on the DEI bandwagon. And I say the DEI bandwagon. And the reason I said, even in the introduction of this show, is that we need to discuss diversity, equity, and inclusion beyond the boardroom, because sometimes the people in the boardroom don't have diverse voices present to share their perspective. And so they're creating solutions for a problem that the people outside of the boardroom didn't create. And so for me, DEI is more than a buzzword on a billboard. And I think people latched onto it because they felt like it was the right thing to do. But some other people latched onto it because they didn't want to look bad. It wasn't because they truly felt like, okay, this is a moral item that I need to have in my company and or I should consider, but I want to do it for public appearance. Even though internally, I may not be treating employees of different demographic backgrounds with the same respect that I do others. And so for me, witnessing certain things, experiencing certain things, I wanted to bring light to that, either through education, training, and also having conversations with different individuals regarding how diversity impacts them in their own life experiences. So we've touched on diverse demographics and minority populations briefly, but even when you think about families and the demographics of families and how it impacts how individuals are perceived. Gender diversity, when we look at the number of people in certain seats, in certain positions based on gender. When we look at women's wages, there is wage disparities that have been discussed over the years, more so recently and even before, highlighting the fact that there's a gender pay gap. So we can't ignore the data. We can't ignore the research. Another reason why DEI shouldn't die. And when we look at other aspects of diversity, so we talked about racial and ethnic. We talked about briefly, because there's so many layers to this. So I will say that 2024, there is more. We will dedicate these episodes to really talking about why DEI shouldn't die in different ways. But it's important that we consider the fact that people are different and that we have to care about diversity, equity, and inclusion, not just because it impacts our bottom line, but it's because it's the right thing to do. And sometimes I think we may not think about it, but subconsciously, we have to make decisions that are equitable. And people say, what's the difference with it being equitable or equal? Well, equal says we give everyone the same playing field. So say, for instance, I know I've seen online, there's a graphic of individuals trying to look at a sports game, and they're starting from different vantage points. So someone in a wheelchair may need a different accommodation versus someone who's standing or someone who's sitting. And so when we think about equity, equity says, how can I get the person where they are? How can I meet them where they are to give them the ability to still be able to watch that game? So the person in the wheelchair, perhaps I give them a platform and a ramp. The person who is standing, perhaps I just need to give them a box to stand on. The person that is sitting, perhaps I just have to ask them to stand. So there's different ways in which equity plays out. And so equity is really meeting people where they are and giving them the ability to still have the same standard of living that everyone else has. And as a Black woman, even when I think about my birthing experience for my daughter, when you look at the data, research from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention showed that Black women have the highest maternal mortality rate in the United States. And it is 69.9 per 100,000 live births. That was as of 2021, almost 3 times the rate for white women in the same time period and in the United States. And I can tell you, going through that experience, it was pretty traumatic, to say the least. I am grateful that I am here, but I went through a situation in which I had to have an emergency C-section. And even with that, it took 8 hours for me to get the care that I needed. I was laying in the hospital bed for 8 hours, and all of these other individuals they kept playing the music. So they were having their babies, but I was laying in a hospital bed after I was told that morning that there was no amniotic fluid and that I needed to go to the hospital immediately. I still wasn't treated for another 8 hours. But on top of that, the day before, I called the doctor with the complication I experienced, and they told me that the hospital did not have a bed prepared, which is odd considering I had gone in advance to complete all of my paperwork and all of those things so that a bed would be ready because my daughter was born late. And so when I think about that experience and then going through a miscarriage in 2020, when I read things like this, it really hits home for me and is one of the reasons why I wanted to start this podcast, just to get people to think about a different perspective. Just because it's not your experience doesn't mean that it's not someone else's. And so when we say things like DEI should die, or that the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and also belonging, that these things do not enhance this country, I think it sends the wrong message. We make it seem like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also belonging is too much work for us to do, but it's not too much work for us when we want to benefit from said individuals. And so I think that there are many opportunities and discussion points for this topic. Today, I wasn't going to give you the 1,000 reasons why, but I did want you to consider some of the reasons why DEI shouldn't die, because we have to be mindful about how we talk about equity. And I saw a great article that was talking about this specifically. And in that article by Elisa Frazier, she stated, by practicing our equity values in our language, we can design our products and programs to not only address capital needs, but also to shift the underlying mindsets that uphold institutional racism. And racism in this country is something that the individuals that were brought here from Africa and now their descendants, which I am one of, we did not ask for that. That is something someone else inflicted upon those individuals, and then they hold them accountable for what they don't know, even though there were systematic racism and racist policies in place that prevented said individuals from being educated and more. And so there is topics about this. You can find it all over the internet. But I think the benefit of talking to other people and hearing their perspective is that you may realize that there are things that you have not thought about that maybe you should, or things that you realize may be hindering you from seeing people in a certain way and or light because it's not your experience. So just because it's not your experience doesn't mean that it's not someone else's. And to dismiss someone else's experience because it's not yours, I think diminishes the value that those individuals bring. We are all unique. We all bring a unique perspective. And the reason that I quoted the young lady previously, the article was titled, "Not All Developers of Color Are Emerging: The Importance of Language in Improving Capital Access for Racial Justice." And so she was interviewing a gentleman by the name of Jay. He is a municipal developer, and he established his own firm. And he talked about the fact that while he created his own firm, he has grown. He noticed that there were more opportunities from large financial institutions for real estate developers of color like him. But they called it emerging entrepreneurs. So the fact that he was someone who had had success, he would not consider himself as emerging because he says that developers of color, it inaccurately puts a business school graduate who wants to go into housing development, an immigrant family with a real estate portfolio, and a long-standing developer like him in the same category with people who may be just starting out. And so when individuals who come from a background of power, they tend to look at it as like, maybe let me help you, because then it shows that this group over here, they don't have the ability, nor do they have the capacity, the education, the expertise, the experience needed to move forward. They don't have the ability, so they need us to come in and help them. And so when we think about things like that, his business grew, but he said the language cut him out of the process. So that's where that quote came from in terms of when we practice equity in our language. So even when I think back to how I started this with the article regarding Elon Musk, and he explains why he feels like the policies can be another form of discrimination, but he sits from a place of being a billionaire. And so his perspective about life is going to be different than someone who may just be barely paying their bills, because their life experience is different, their daily experience is different, and then also their perspective on wants versus needs is different just because of the nature that it is. And so when we say things that say things like it's not based on merit and that it creates additional discrimination or a different form of discrimination, that language in and of itself, to me, feels like we're trying to uphold a patriarchy. So we are utilizing certain language to describe DEI to make it sound as though the purpose of DEI was not necessarily upheld over the last several years because it has created reverse discrimination or from his perspective. And he's well within his right to have his perspective. I just think that because it's not prioritized in some places, then we will continue to see more of the same. And so, and I understand, even when you look at the data, there's an article, the one I mentioned earlier by Built In, but one of the things that they noted in their 50 diversity in the workplace statistics to know is that groups formerly seen as minorities may reach majority by 2045. So it's not lost on me that this may create fear in individuals who have traditionally been in a position of power, because now there's a power shift. There's a power dynamic that is going to be different than what individuals may be used to experiencing. And so how do we ensure that this does not disrupt our way of living? And so when we think about these things, I think that is what we should at least consider, is the fact that everyone does have a different perspective, but that does not mean that one perspective is better than the other. But I think it's important that we consider all perspectives, and or at least try to consider the fact that just because it's your experience doesn't mean it's others. So for me, when I read that, I thought to myself, well, that's insinuating a lot of things about a large group of people, whereas being a part of a minority group, I can say from my experience, I don't look at all individuals in power and say they don't deserve to be in their position, that maybe they just got there because of who they know, not what they know. I haven't made that assumption, but I feel like when you say things like, if we restore true meritocracy in this country, which this country was not built on true meritocracy, and embrace true diversity of thought, chances are we are actually going to have a bunch of different shades of element and a range of genders and different positions. But the only thing that was mentioned here, and I believe when it's mentioned different shades, that it may be also talking about race. But when we think about that, traditionally, even for women in the workplace, there has been a ongoing conversation about ensuring that even women have certain opportunities. So I find it hard to believe that we didn't start with a meritocracy. We didn't start with true diversity of thought. We didn't start with different shades, nor did we start with different genders in certain positions. So to think that all of a sudden it's going to self-correct now after hundreds of years of institutionalized racism and laws that were created to keep certain people in a place, I have a hard time believing that we're going to be able to change it today. Just off of true meritocracy, without some type of intervention and or acknowledgement of what is really happening, not looking at the data, not looking at the fact that research is telling us, the data is telling us that we still have a systematic problem that we need to address. We are not going to be able to resolve it by ignoring it. So I hope at a high level, this really made you think about why DEI shouldn't die. But there will be more episodes this year specifically focused on this topic, and also having conversations with other people and sharing via social media, whether that's on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com /@theperspectiveview, or even on social media. So I will say in closing, remember, the world revolves around the context of perspective.